Why big tech is collapsing? The coming big tech crisis.
Silicon
Let's find
Valley
out
is in
why
chaos. Almost all
big
of the
tech
major big tech
is
companies are
collapsing.
For example, Meta was worth over $1 trillion in 2021, but just a year later, and their value has dropped by 2/3. And the other giants
Wow. Is that true? Their valuation was $1 billion and now $250 million. I mean, I will say right off the bat, number one, a valuation of a company does not necessarily mean that that's actually what the company is worth. A lot of it's just speculation of what people maybe think a company could be worth in the future. And you see this a lot in the stock market where, like, especially in the tech stock market, where a lot of these companies get these huge valuations, but then when it comes to actually creating revenue and stuff and actually showing revenue, it's actually quite low, because typically I think it's something like 7 to 10 times what a company makes per year. Is like the valuation of the company. At least that's kind of like the old way. But with tech, it seems to have gotten thrown out the window.
aren't far behind. Amazon, Meta, Twitter, Tesla, and Netflix have all seen massive revenue drops, and the scale.
And all of these tech companies definitely have seen some massive drops. However, so has a lot of industries have seen huge drops. And we are starting to see some of these turn around a bit and start to go back up. So is there probably a drop in tech? Yes. Is it as severe as this video might make it out to be? That's yet to be seen, because we need to see what happens when the stock market recovers and how much those actually come back up.
All of these losses is unprecedented, especially considering big tech has been so unstoppable for the last decade. In fact, revenues and profits were skyrocketing. Silicon Valley was a billionaire factory, with some of the most prolific billionaires building their names and their bank accounts on the back of big tech companies. Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, all of them were created by the massive tech boom of the last 4 decades. But then the bubble popped, and now the biggest names in Silicon Valley are seeing their revenue plummet, firing hundreds of thousands of employees, with the stock value of almost every big tech company falling dramatically.
I mean, again, that's definitely true. 100%. But again, it's not just the tech industry that we're seeing this in. We're seeing this in a lot of industries.
So quickly. Well, you see, tech was a growing part of the world's economy for years. Over the last decade, tech companies have only got larger and larger. Now, of course, there were ups and downs. For example, the dot-com crash of the late 90s proved the catastrophic consequences of overvaluing tech companies. However, over time, the industry always picked up again. It was a measured climb at first, but soon people forgot the mistakes of the past.
You know, and a lot of this is, just like with the dot-com bubble crash or whatever, definitely that happens. And what happens a lot of times, especially in new tech fields, is there is a lot of valuation that comes out. Like, we're just seeing this also in the cryptocurrency and NFT space lately. So when it comes out, like, there's tons and tons of money pouring in to the industry, and everybody thinks that all of these projects or all of these things are going to make a ton of money. But the truth is, most of them are going to end up failing. I mean, something like, 8 out of 10 small businesses, not in just tech, but just, 8 out of 10 out of all industries, 8 out of 10 small businesses end up failing, or some crazy number like that. Don't quote me on the exact number, but it's high. Most businesses fail. That's the same in these new emerging markets as well. And, is tech new necessarily? A new market? No. I mean, tech's, now been out for a while, but social media sites are still fairly new. A lot of social media sites. I mean, Facebook's been around for quite some time now. So there's a lot of this is still being figured out in this space.
And as the years rolled by and technology improved, the companies behind it grew richer and richer. But there were massive problems on the horizon for Silicon Valley, because the path wasn't all golden. For example, companies like Uber have coasted on their potential, hoovering up investments without a proper model for profitability. The same can be said for Twitter, and yet despite this, all of the giants of the industry grew to immense proportions on paper. For example, in 2018, Meta surpassed $500 billion in net worth, and Amazon were closing in on $1 trillion. But all of these companies had a similar problem. They just weren't worth what people thought they were. Their business models were shaky and in constant need of investment, or they just didn't make that much money to begin with. Their margins were always incredibly tight, and that's why almost all of these tech billionaires never look at the stock price.
That whole period is very interesting, because the stock is not the company, and the company is not the stock. And so as I watched the stock fall from 113 to 6, I was also watching all of our internal business metrics. Every single thing about the business was getting better and fast.
Because they believed as their technology spread into every aspect of the world, companies would always ride the wave of future potential. Their shaky business model just didn't appear to be an issue at this point. All these big tech companies were gaining more and more power, and it seemed like they were untouchable, because big tech had something invaluable: the eyeballs and data of the entire world. You see, ever since they started,
I mean, it is crazy the amount of reach and lack of oversight that these tech companies have when it comes to people's data and what they can do with it. I definitely think this could be part of why we've seen some issues with big tech, because I think a lot of people have realized a lot of the issues that can come along with the tech. Not that the tech is inherently bad or anything like that. It's just, everything is run by humans and humans make mistakes. And so the way that our data is being stored, or the way that our data is being used, is not necessarily always keeping the consumer's best interest in mind. So I think they've definitely been hurt over the last, 2 years or so, a lot when it comes to like data and how they're using data and the tracking of consumers.
Putting in user data at the massive levels they do now, social media companies were then further driven to maximize their engagement, keeping people on their app for as long as possible, and often as possible became the most important thing, which is why we're all so addicted to our phones and our laptops. It makes all of these big tech companies billions of dollars, allowing them to sell more and more ads and exploit more and more of your data. And over time, these companies perfected this process by manipulating psychology, making the apps so addictive that the entire world couldn't live without their smartphone. And during this process, they found out that anger and fear are some of the best ways to keep people engaged. And so as the algorithms were
this is all true. I mean, as a business, you want to keep people using your business, whether you're a social media company or whether you're a gas station. You want people to use your business. Because I've been in marketing and sales and stuff for quite some time, even in the early days of tech, when Facebook and stuff, like I was there when Facebook launched. I was working in the field already of marketing with Google AdWords and stuff. It was talked about like, if you do this with your content, it'll psychologically, like if you use green colors on landing pages for financial services, you'll have higher click-through rates because green's associated with money. And little things like that you pick up as marketers, that people talk about as marketers, that do affect you on a psyche level, and you're, on a psychology type level. And so that's definitely 100% true. But I also think it's easy to blame all of these social media companies for like, they're using, the humans' flaws against us or whatever. But I think at some point we also have to take on the responsibility ourselves and realize that like if we're getting addicted to this content, like you should properly set up ways to manage how much time you're spending online on social platforms, things like that. And if you don't, then that definitely falls, I think, on you. It's the same as like impulsive gamblers and stuff. Like there are people that just can't not gamble, and I don't think that falls necessarily on the gambling industry. There are people that can't stop drinking, but does that necessarily fall on the alcohol producers? Because there's also 90% of people can't control themselves when it comes to these things that are sometimes labeled as issues of society or whatever. 90% of people don't necessarily struggle with it. And so to penalize those 90% people because of the 10% that can't doesn't seem like the answer either. And so same with like social media. What are you going to do? Start being like China and like limit their kids to, they're allowed like one. I think it's China that does this, where they limit the amount of time that people under 18 can use the internet or like social media or whatever, and they can do it like an hour a day or something like that. To have that kind of regimen against this stuff also doesn't seem very wise or smart.
Fine-tuned for engagement, they push more extreme and more provocative posts above everything else, putting them in front of everyone's faces constantly, all while censoring any.
I also think this, talking about like putting the content and stuff, that's controversial in front of people. Like people think big tech is doing this, and Gary Vee says that it's not changing us, it's exposing us. And what he means by that is like, humans like to get involved in, if something goes against one of their beliefs, naturally, without even the tech or not tech, humans get upset about that. I mean, we've seen that throughout history when it comes to politics and religion and things like that. It's just seen on a bigger scale. Because it's on such a larger scale, it's now felt more deeply. You see it more often. You have more people grouping together that are able to then use their voice to all come together and have a voice about these issues and stuff on a larger scale. I think this is issues of humanity itself and not so much the tech companies. I don't think big tech is necessarily trying to spread discord among, citizens of the world. I think they build these algorithms that their job is to feed you the information you want. And so if what's being fed to you is these videos and stuff, whether that's conspiracy theories, whether that's like, anti-vax or pro-vax material, whether that's, anti-Semitic material. I mean, whatever that material is, you're getting served that because the algorithm's determining that you like those type of videos because of your search history, your viewing history, because you're right. Like, they want you to stay on their platform as much as possible and as long as possible, which means they're going to show you the content you want to see. And you might say, oh, I don't want to see all that stuff. It gets fed to me just because they know I'll react to it. Well, exactly. You're getting fed it because the algorithm knows you'll react to it. You'll watch it. You'll comment on it. You'll share it with your friends. Same thing. Same thing. I just think when people say, when they think about content being recommended to them, they only think about the good content being recommended to them. And like, oh, I like watching cat videos, so I get recommended cat videos by the algorithm. Yes. But if you also like watching conspiracy videos and you watch most conspiracy videos that pop up on your feed, if you watch most of them through to the end, then you're going to get shown more conspiracy videos. I mean, that's just how the algorithm works. So again, I don't know that that's something big tech is maliciously trying to do, as much as it's just the flaws of humanity being shown on a much larger scale because of technology.
Any information that didn't fit into Silicon Valley's political narrative, which is why Twitter, Meta, and all these other companies became the breeding ground for social media addiction, censorship, and hatred. And as time went on, the cycle ramped up and the culture war worsened. And these changes in the online space were reflected in the real world, leading to riots, unrest, and collapse.
And I will say, I mean, I do think that it's, because in the last year or so, you have seen all these tech companies start to regulate more what they do allow and what they label as like misinformation and stuff. And I do disagree with that in a lot of ways. That's actually something that what he's talking about right now is something I do disagree with, because again, it's humans then trying to regulate what is right and what is wrong. And unfortunately, the problem with humanity is we always think we're right in the moment. And it's not until later that we found out we were wrong. When cigarettes first came out, even doctors promoted that you should smoke cigarettes. When, oh my gosh, what's it called? Like the stuff that's like radioactive. And they used to put it in everything, like even in makeup and stuff, and it like caused people to basically become radioactive and stuff, and have all these issues with their skin and stuff. You get it from X-rays and all that. What is it called? I can't think of the word right now. But like all of this stuff was seen as safe to start, and it was later found out that it wasn't. But for some reason, like nowadays in 2023, 2022, we think even more that like we're 100% right with everything that we come out with everything that we do. Instead of realizing that we could be 100% flawed in our thinking. Like, for example, we 100%, think, just to use this as an example, and I will say, like, I got my COVID shots and booster, but we 100% think that the COVID vaccine is safe, and we say, oh, science proves it, da-da-da-da. Science also at one point, again, said that smoking was safe. And you can argue, well, the right tests weren't done. Sure, but you could argue that now. I mean, we don't know. You just don't know. And again, I'm not saying that our scientific process isn't better today than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. However, I'm just saying there's still flaws that pop up all the time, and we act like that doesn't happen. And so I do agree that censoring all these people and everything is not necessarily a great idea, because the problem is then you're just ostracizing them more, and then they kind of get even more hate, and they conglomerate together even more. And then, at some point you get to the point where you just have ostracized so many people that they start their own thing. Like, you're starting to see that with like Truth Social Network and stuff, and all of these things. And like, again, I just don't know that solves any of the issues as well. And in the defense of tech people, tech companies, again, they started doing this because everybody was out there crying like, oh, these tech companies are causing, animosity between citizens. These tech companies are causing division in people in the United States and in the world. And the truth is, no, humans were already doing that. It just got amplified by tech because of the global reach that technology has.
It didn't matter to the tech companies though. In fact, this was in their interest. And instead of tackling the problems that they had caused themselves with their algorithms, companies started to then lean further on censorship, suppressing all counter opinions in the name of misinformation. But this solution wouldn't work forever. Tech companies were going to pay the cost for their meddling in public discourse. However, for now, they had to deal with a much more conventional problem: competition. Over the past decade, China has exploded into the technology industry. Companies like Tencent, Huawei, and ByteDance have been eating into the Western market share on a global scale. In fact, Tencent has made numerous takeovers of Western companies like Riot, Epic Games, and even Ubisoft. And through these
I don't think very many people realize Tencent owns so much digital stuff nowadays. League of Legends, Riot Games, Valorant, all of those, Epic Games. I mean, as it just said here, Ubisoft. It's crazy the amount of companies that they're bought into here in the United States. I mean, even, TikTok now, which I don't know if that's Tencent, but it's ByteDance or whatever, but another Chinese company. Like, it's definitely crazy. Like, and I'm definitely a progressive when it comes to like global economy and stuff, and the internet bringing about global economies and global, kind of the workforce just becoming global and not really mattering where you live and where you work, like, because a lot of it will be done online and stuff. But I do think we still need to remember that China is and has proven to be very much against a lot of human rights that we value in a lot of Western societies, and they do some crazy stuff. So to allow them to necessarily have all of this power and influence might not be the best thing.
These moves, they've undermined Western dominance in the lucrative gaming industry, with China owning some of the most popular games today like Fortnite and League of Legends. And China's also taking over with things like TikTok and Tencent's investments in Reddit and Discord. And then Huawei attacked hardware manufacturers.
I did not know that Tencent was invested into Reddit and Discord as well. That's crazy.
Releasing cheaper alternatives loaded with Chinese data collection technology. Xiaomi did the same.
Has there been any proof that these? I know there was some controversy a while back ago that these I can't say it, Hawaii phones or whatever were people were afraid they were collecting data or whatever. But is it actually true? Has there actually ever been any proof that they're actually collecting data with these devices? I'm just curious. Again, I'm not for China. I think we definitely shouldn't be allowing China to do all of this stuff that they do, even a lot of the manufacturing that they do for the United States. But I mean, has any of this actually been proven?
But to even greater effect, despite only being founded in 2010, they've gained over 12% of the market already.
Wow, that's crazy. They're right behind Apple and Samsung.
And ByteDance is probably the most sinister. I mean, China was well aware of the disruptive powers of social media long before the West had any idea, and they studied what the Western companies were doing with engagement and turned it into an art form. With TikTok exploding in popularity by playing on Silicon Valley's addictive business model, and by learning from Silicon Valley's successes and mistakes, TikTok has grown by 400% every single year, seizing...
That's crazy. That's huge. It is ridiculous how much TikTok has grown over the last couple years. So much so that basically every other social media platform is now copying short form video.
Western social media companies' audiences from under their noses, which is why almost every major app has now adopted TikTok's short video model. And to put it plainly, this is a targeted attack on Silicon Valley. All these companies have incredibly close relationships with the CCP, which has given them enormous room to scale up, because no matter how profitable these companies are, they've always got the Chinese government behind their back, and this gives them a massive advantage over the West. They don't have to deal with pesky human rights laws.
That's exactly what I was saying a minute ago. They don't necessarily follow all the human right, stuff that the Western, those pesky human right laws.
Impediments, or even profitability. Instead, they can be safe in the knowledge that as long as they pull the party line, they can get away with virtually anything. And this isn't just within China, this is everywhere. They get government backing abroad, as all of these Chinese big social media sites are practically a third party of the Chinese government. And as they work in tandem, these companies have become an unstoppable force. And so whilst the Western tech companies are always at each other's throats, China's tech giants have been allowed to build their monopolies in peace, which is why every day China gains a little more ground on the West, because for every user and customer that China gains, Silicon Valley gets weaker, and this new threat has been awful for big tech's bottom lines, and the true consequences have only just begun today. These problems were still on the horizon, but they hadn't affected the numbers yet. Apps like TikTok were only just getting started and massive growth was still expected. And by the end of 2016, some journalists were hailing Silicon Valley as the future. They said this because something dramatic...
New World Order begins, oh no.
had changed. The list of the top companies used to always be dominated by oil and manufacturing, and a few financial giants that relied on their sheer scale to dominate. But these companies have now been replaced by Google, Amazon, Tesla, Apple, and Microsoft, pushing out the old guard. However, despite their immense valuations, these companies still weren't nearly as profitable as they should have been. From 1995 to 2015, Amazon only made $2 billion in profit.
But that's also because Amazon very much is purposely not making a bunch of profit because of tax reasons. And number two, they've also invested a ton of money basically into developing a brand new postal service. I mean, Amazon delivery is basically a FedEx or a UPS or a USPS service at this point. If USPS ever actually does go bankrupt, like, you know, has kind of been of concern in the last couple of years, honestly, the government would probably just pay Amazon to start delivering the mail. Like, that's how good their freaking system is at this point. Like, let's be honest, dude. Like, pretty much anything you can order at this point, like, it's not even 2-day shipping anymore. Most of the time you get it next day. Like, next day. Sometimes if you order early enough in the morning, you'll get it same day. I know in some big cities you have like hour delivery and stuff, you know, in 1 hour get something delivered. So what they've done in terms of just logistics is crazy. No other shipping company has done it like they have. So I mean, a lot of money has gone into building that out as well, which is going to be a long-term investment. It's going to make them money for years to come, because the more you can shorten the time of the product arriving to the customer, the better you are able to compete with brick and mortar stores.
Despite the company approaching $1 trillion net worth. Now, yes, this move was meant.
Again, I do agree, though, that some of these valuations of these companies are crazy. And full disclosure, I invest in stocks, and I've invested in a lot of these tech companies and have made a lot of money because of them. So, I mean, I'm happy that they have that high valuations, but it is kind of crazy at the same time.
Yet it still portrayed a significant disconnect between Silicon Valley and the rest of the world. Rather than focusing on profitability, Silicon Valley companies were much more focused on growth. And the best example of this is Uber.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they are focused on growth instead of profitability. Meaning, you know, they don't care to make a ton of money if they know that right now they're still in a growth phase. Walmart knows that it's pretty much, I mean, at this point, like, it has grown about as big as it's going to grow. And in fact, has regressed a little bit because of online shopping. So they're not pumping a ton of money into growth. Whereas Amazon still has a lot of market share they can pick up. A lot of these tech companies still have a lot of market share that they can pick up. There's still entire older generations that don't use a lot of these services.
You see, Uber spent years focused entirely on growth above anything else. They embodied the Silicon Valley mantra, breaking laws in industries to cement themselves in the market.
I mean, Uber definitely has done some shady shit over the years. Got
the massive leak showing that Uber executives were shown instructing their employees to
use Lyft.
use chaos and violence to uproot the taxi industry and put pressure on governments. And of course, they had big problems with actually making enough money. I mean, their business model still has incredibly low margins, even after they started to squeeze every penny they could and raising all of their prices, which has caused Uber to be in a worrying situation. With market saturation, their stock price is plummeting, and the company's dreams of market dominance are now fading into the ground. But Uber does still have a slight chance, as Silicon Valley overconfidence has led to way more destructive collapses, specifically in the case of WeWork. In early 2019, WeWork was seen as an innovative new company that was set.
I'm surprised WeWork hasn't done better, but it kind of makes sense, honestly, too, because I think just most people, like with the pandemic and stuff, they realize like just work from home. Put that money into building a home office. Like, why rent an office space when you could just build something in your house to do it? And it's going to be way cheaper over time. Most employees are just, they don't want to pay to rent, let's say they don't want to build their own office buildings. Like, they're not going to want to pay to rent office buildings for their employees in different cities and stuff for their remote workers. Basically pay them nothing to work in their own houses and have to do their own renovations in their houses for work. I mean, it ain't like work gives you budgets and stuff for, I mean, I know I work from home. It ain't like my work gives me any kind of budget for office chairs or desks or mice or keyboards or any of the stuff that they would pay for in a normal office. And with WeWork or any of those types of rental offices, if you were paying for those as an employer for employees that worked remotely, like, you better believe included in that cost is them recouping things like having to provide desks and chairs and this and that and all of these different things. So it's definitely much cheaper for these companies just to have their employees work from home.
To change the world of work. Although it was founded in New York, the Silicon Valley mentality had definitely gotten to its founder, Adam Neumann. The charismatic CEO was so good at convincing investors that he pulled in billions. And only a few years after its founding, the company had raised over $1 billion for their office space company.
Wow,
and I say office
over
space
$1
company,
billion.
but WeWork was still listed as a tech company. And so WeWork managed to raise over $1 billion for the company, and this was despite mass layoffs at the company and poor financial performance, because simply enough, investors were just in love with the idea, rather than the product in front of them. In fact, WeWork lost over $2 billion in 2018, and yet the hype continued. Analysis stated that the company was now worth over $40 billion. This was more than giants like Airbnb, and by September, the company attempted to gain even more investor money, beginning the process of an IPO or initial public offering, and this would open the shares of the company to the public, raising even further billions for WeWork. And yet even with this enormous amount of investment, the IPO started to gain scrutiny as investors started to see that the company was really making no money, and it portrayed the true reality of the Silicon Valley business model: massive debt and low revenue propped up by other people's money. And so their $40 billion valuation was cut by 3/4 in a matter of days, resulting in 20% of the company being fired, and Neumann, their CEO, and other executives were all forced to resign, and the company was forced to cut back on its massive growth plans. Reality hit the company hard, and today people are questioning the expiry date of WeWork. But yet again, Silicon Valley didn't learn from this example. Despite the very same business practices being used across tons of tech companies, this was just seen as an isolated case by tech elites. Besides, now wasn't the time to consolidate and slow down. And then as 2019 came and went, the world was forced into the pandemic.
First U.S. case has been detected.
Even the pandemic probably hurt companies like WeWork, because that even more so people were like work from home because they didn't want to be around other people or near other people and possibly transmit or receive infections and stuff from people. And I think that's another reason people have more pushed to just work from home and not in cohabited office spaces or whatever.
There's confirmation the coronavirus has reached Australia.
And it was here that tech companies would double down. COVID-19, as it was for so many other billionaires and corporations, was a massive opportunity for big tech. The pandemic saw tech companies' values rise by hundreds of billions. They made so much money, they barely even knew what to do with it. And it was the belief at the top of these companies that this is just how things were. Tech dominance into the future seemed all but guaranteed. Zuckerberg and others would be risky and short-sighted in their investments, assuming that revenue levels would stay strong after the pandemic. And that's why Meta's workforce grew by 28% in just a year, and Amazon massively expanded their own operations, seeing their profits soar by over 220%. Apple spent an extra $90 billion just buying back their own stock during the pandemic, betting an amount worth more than the GDP of Sri Lanka on their continued success. You see, tech companies made massive investments into themselves, betting that the good times would never end, and it was this overconfidence that meant that when their profits finally did start to slow down, they wouldn't be able to cope with it. But overconfidence wasn't the only problem that worsened during the pandemic. You see, the culture war was getting more and more intense as people spent more time online. Unwinnable arguments raged as people's lives got measurably worse. And whilst the pandemic was lucrative for tech companies, they were some of the only winners, with lockdowns completely destroying the economy, putting millions out of jobs and businesses out of business. And it's important.
See, I mean, but this is what I was saying like earlier in the video is like, these job layoffs and stuff has happened throughout all industries. So like now you're saying like, oh, they've done great during the pandemic as all these other companies have failed. But now we're talking about how they're not doing great. Like they might have been doing great then, but now they're feeling the effect of the same economy that all these other industries are feeling. So I would be curious to know, like let's say Facebook cut 20% of their workforce is what I think they said. How much have some of these other, what percentage has some of these other industries cut their workforce by? That would be a number I'd be interested in seeing.
Possible to measure the negative effects of the pandemic on people and their mental health. However, what was measurable was the heating up of the culture war. And eventually the result of this would be social media fatigue. People were just sick of the culture war. And China was now also closing in on Silicon Valley, as over the pandemic, TikTok grew by hundreds of millions of users, surpassing 1.1 billion in 2021. However, all of these combining factors hadn't affected big tech yet, but it would only be a matter of time. Meanwhile, the tech billionaires were enjoying their moments in the sun. Jeff Bezos spent millions on a personal space trip, whilst Elon Musk became Times Person of the Year for 2021. But all of this would turn out to be some of the last good news these tech billionaires had, as once the world finally opened up again, it signaled the end of Silicon Valley's boom, even if no one believed it.
I did see Tesla lower the price of all of their vehicles, dramatically.
For example, at Meta, revenue growth had risen to over 50% in the summer of 2021, but it dropped sharply over the next 9 months, falling to just 5% by the first quarter of 2022. Amazon also saw a sharp decline, from over 40% to around 7% in the same time.
I mean, that's natural though, like as the COVID restrictions and everything ended and people started going back outside more. I mean, of course those numbers are going to re-drop. They're not going to stay at the peak that they were during the pandemic after the pandemic's over. Some people would argue the pandemic's still going on, but you know what I'm saying. Like the fact that most stuff's open back up nowadays, at least here in the United States.
Stable companies like Microsoft or Apple suffered the same fate, seeing their growth levels fall off. So what happened here? Well, all of the growing problems that Silicon Valley thought they could ignore were finally making their mark. And whilst they had been shielded from the pandemic recession by artificial demand, that was all over now, and the economy was only getting worse. So people began to spend much less on products. People didn't care about ads. Essentials became more expensive, so people had less disposable income. Services saw a boost as well, as people made up for the lost time. And on top of this, the culture war had burned tons of people out as well, leading to less usage of social media. A Canadian survey found that less people were using Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter in 2022 than in 2020, and the only tech company that was
Again, I think this data is very skewed because 2020 was the height of the pandemic. So, I mean, again, like, I'm not shocked that numbers haven't dropped now that things are kind of back to normal in 2022 going into 2023. It's kind of I don't know. I mean, what was it before 2020? You know, what was it in 2018, 2016? Like, I think we need more years here than just, you know, but the problem is the graph probably looks like this. Way up, a little bit down, you know, but still higher than it was in 2018. So it doesn't look as good. And it's not as fear mongering as if you just do from 2020 to 2022. So the height of the pandemic to now out of the pandemic.
bad from the decline was TikTok. Their growth was unimpeded, maybe because they're artificially propped.
Well, maybe because they're artificially propped up, but also just because they were a new social media company or are a newer social media company. So they still have a lot of room for growth. There's still a lot of people that can join it compared to, I mean, most people nowadays have Facebook accounts. So you're not going to have as many people signing up every day for Facebook like you would with a company where most people still do not have an account. And at this point, maybe people do. I mean, they have now registered over 1.1 billion or whatever they said. So maybe at this point they do, but
up by the Chinese government. But it was clear for everyone in Silicon Valley that they were losing their audience's attention, and with this dramatic reduction in attention came dramatic cuts in their profits. And this is when the crack started to show. Tech companies had become so focused on growth that when it dried up, it hit them much harder than other industries. Over the course of 2022, tech companies lost more and more money, leading to their CEOs to make some erratic decisions. Musk took over as CEO of Twitter after years of negotiations and legal battles. He started off by firing large parts of the workforce, leading to massive technical glitches and problems with the app. Things were going so badly that he was forced to resign from the company. Google had
I mean, he fired a bunch of people not because necessarily that the company was in a bunch of trouble. He did it because he realized a lot of people that were working there weren't really doing anything. And that it was a very bloated company when it comes to employees. Like, everybody forgets, like, sometimes a company just needs to fire employees and stuff. I mean, it sucks for sure, but sometimes it just needs to happen because these companies get so bloated over time with people that get hired and hired and hired. And then the funny thing is, a lot of these companies, especially when they're in growth phases, it's amazing how many people will hire somebody else to do their work so that they don't have to do any work. And then you come to find out later that, like, a lot of these managements and stuff, they're not doing anything. They've hired all these other people below them to do everything, and they're just kind of chilling. And it happens a lot more than you would realize, and especially in tech companies. I mean, there's been whole videos that have come out on YouTube of, like, people doing, I mean, even with Twitter, when he took over, there was videos going around of, like, a day in the life of a Twitter employee. And, like, these people are like, oh, I got to go get my, coffee over here from the coffee thing, and now we're gonna go into this room and chill, meditation room for half an hour, and it's like, okay, well, how much work are you doing in an 8-hour shift? And I'm not saying people should have to, like, be doing 8 hours of straight hard work, but I'm just saying at some point, like, your job is going to become irreplaceable if you're not really doing anything. And at some point, companies are gonna trim the fat.
Put much of their focus on their new Stadia cloud console, but as with every other
Stadia was a fail, but I'll be honest, most stuff Google seems to come out with fails. Like, they had, like, the search engine and it was great, but, like, I mean, my God, Google Plus just like all this stuff over the years, like, it just does not seem like most of it does well. Even Chromecast got beat out by Amazon. Their Google Assistant, got beat out by, the Echo, all of that stuff. So
The big tech company, 2022 also saw its demise, being forced to refund everyone who bought it without Google actually getting the products back. Additionally, Uber saw a sharp decline in their business, to ruthless competition, massive leaks, and higher prices. Meta stock value dropped by around 60%, with Tesla's dropping by 70%. So once 2022 was nearing its end, tech companies realized it wasn't going to get any better anytime soon. They needed to cut costs, which is why you started to see articles of these big tech companies firing tens of thousands of workers, like with Microsoft firing over 1,000 employees, then Stripe, a growing startup, letting go of 14% of their workforce. Elon was forced to lay off nearly 4,000 people from Twitter, with Meta following shortly after, laying off a further 11,000 people. Amazon cut their numbers by 10,000, and all of this had happened in just over a month. Eventually, Amazon would double their numbers in December, as clearly they hadn't shrunk enough. And these weren't minimum wage employees either. They were both high-skilled and incredibly expensive employees. And in total, over 1,000 tech companies fired.
I mean, that kind of goes along with my point, though, that a lot of times it ends up being these higher up management teams and stuff that have, during a growth phase, there's so much money being thrown around that they hire and hire and hire all these people to do these things so that they don't have to, that at some point, a lot of them aren't no longer doing anything. And again, I don't mean that in a bad way. It happens.
Over 150,000 workers. But Silicon Valley had made their bed with their risky investments and growth-focused ethos. The same companies that had fought over these workers in the talent wars, which was just a year or two ago, were now letting them go and incurring massive costs in the process. And it wasn't just going to cost them at the time either. These firing sprees represent a massive amount of people with incredibly valuable skills. A job board called Tech Jobs for Good has seen massive increases in skilled job seekers off of the back of these layoffs. People who have seen the fast life of big tech companies are now instead looking to make a difference despite a small hit to their paychecks. And this is one of the ways in which the collapse of big tech will inadvertently benefit the world. But perhaps this is symptomatic of a much larger trend in our economy. As going into 2023, with the UN predicting we're going to be in a massive recession, it seems like Silicon Valley.
I mean, I do think that that's good that a lot of people are being more conscious about what they're doing with their lives in terms of work and want to provide value to the world. But I don't know that necessarily, I mean, I think a lot of people, a lot of the workforce, because of what big tech has allowed, more freedom during the day. Like, you don't have to work as hard. You know, it's not 8 hours of a construction worker out in the cold, pouring concrete, building, building houses and stuff. Like, you're not busy the whole day, and you do have more free time during work now, that I think more people are questioning, like, what can I do to better serve, which is really cool. For sure, but I don't know how much of that is the fault of tech as much as how much of that has been or has become possible because of tech.
You can only expect more and more suffering. The future looks grim. Ad buys are low,
And I don't know the answer to that.
which is how all of the social media companies like Meta and supply chain issues are now threatening hardware companies like Apple and Microsoft. Governments are also now souring on big tech, seeing their influence as destabilizing. Microsoft's $69 billion acquisition deal for Activision and Blizzard is being debated by monopoly watchdogs around the world. The FTC has already tried to block it. Meanwhile, the whole tech industry is waiting for another.
I mean, that's their job. They do that with lots of stuff, and I would say 90% of the stuff they try to block still ends up going through.
Court verdict.
Just with changes and stuff to how the deal is structured, which is normal. I mean, it's a good thing that it happens.
On recommendation algorithms. Google is being sued for recommending videos made by terrorists, which then incited an attack in France. And if they're found liable, this will upend years of legal doctrine stating that digital platforms aren't responsible for what people post.
The sad part about this, though, is if you start making it the issue of the platforms to regulate content, it then becomes like China. Like, you have these giant firewalls for all these individual countries and stuff, and everybody kind of has their own internets, and it's no longer global, which I think would be much worse for the world as a whole versus not figuring out like this content's always going to exist. I mean, it reminds me, like, what's happening reminds me a lot of, like, back in the day, like we read it, we learned about it in school when all these companies and stuff would burn books and stuff out of libraries because they didn't want their kids reading certain books and stuff, like, that they thought were, whatever. Like, I just don't, blocking information never seems to work if you look throughout history.
Post. The results of the case will dictate what's allowed for years to come and will possibly cripple companies like Google and Meta. It is very clear to everyone in the tech world that 2023 is going to be the true test for these tech giants. And so far, only a week into the year, and Amazon is already shedding 18,000 more jobs, with more cuts expected in the next few months. It should be clear by now that it's going to be a very rough year for Silicon Valley, and only time will tell whether they're ever going to be the giants they once were.
They've definitely had their hardships the last couple years, but they did definitely benefit from the pandemic as well. So I think it's kind of in this state of where's it heading. And again, I don't know if it's just big tech collapsing or if we're just seeing an entire economy collapse and we're seeing all industries collapse and as we head into a recession or whatever. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know down in the comments below. What do you think? Do you think big tech is collapsing, or do you think this is just a byproduct of the economy as a whole and a possible recession? And also, like, do you think it's a good thing that big tech is collapsing? Like, what are your thoughts on big tech and where it's at today in 2023? What do you think about all of the bans and the censorship on social media sites? What do you think about those? Do you think those are helpful? Do you think those are good things? Do you think they're bad things? Would love to know what you think. Definitely an interesting video. You know, again, I tend to be the type of person that looks at everything kind of like glass half full more than half empty. So I try to look at it as like, you know, when I watch these videos, a lot of times it sounds like I'm going against them, but a lot of that is just because I'm like also sitting here thinking like, you know, what if it's this? What if it's that? What if it has nothing to do with this? And again, just like, you know, did big tech? Yeah, sure, lots, but so has normal industries. I mean, look at the oil industry and some of the oil spills, you know, that happened 10 to 15 years ago, all the oil spills that were happening. Is it actually the demise of big tech, or is it just a trim the fat type stage? Hard to tell. Also, if you're not subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We do videos like this all the time, just kind of talking about things happening in the world. Would love to have you be a part of that. Thank you guys so much, as always, and I will see you guys on the next one. Until then, peace out, everybody. Later, nerds.